Today we're going to be making a spare tire or spare wheel set rack or shelf. You can buy a metal one of these on Amazon for about $40 with shipping, or you can make it yourself for about $15 worth of wood and materials, assuming of course you have the right tools. First off, let's start with some materials. I had some hardwood dowels that are going to be the bottom that are going to hold the tire. I had some plywood strips that were not quite big enough to do anything else with, so what I did is I cut them into about a 2.5-inch strip, and that's going to be a backer to keep the tire off the wall. Everything else, these are just 2x2s I had left over that were too bowed to really use on any other project. As for sizing, both the dowels and the long 2x2, they're all about 48 inches. Then I have two lengths of the 2x2 that are shorter. One is about 21 3/4 to 22 inches. It doesn't have to be perfect. You want two of those. Then you're going to have one that's about 21 inches. Again, doesn't need to be perfect. Last thing you're going to need is two of these to have a 45-degree cut on both ends. The large end is just over 20 inches, and then the small end is about 17.5 inches. Again, these don't have to be perfect. As long as they're the same length, it'll look good enough on the wall. Obviously, the first step is to get all your materials, get them cut to the correct lengths or correct approximate lengths. Once you've done that, depending on the finish you're going for, it's a good idea to sand them. I'm going to be hitting things with 80 grit sandpaper just to take off some of the roughness and try to smooth these edges a bit. I don't really have a router to take care of these hard corners, and on one of the other projects I did, I didn't round the corners on the 2x2s, and the corners are kind of sharp when you bump into them. Given that this thing is going to be approximately head level, that's not going to feel great, so for that reason I'm rounding them all out.
The sanding process is relatively easy as long as you have an orbital sander. All you're really doing is rotating the wood and running it along each side until it's a reasonably smooth surface. I also made sure all the ink markings from the manufacturer were removed as well. As I already stated, I'm using an 80 grit sandpaper. However, anywhere between an 80 and a 120 grit's probably fine if you're only going to hit it with one grade. Depending on how nice of a finished product you want, you could work your way up to a 220 grit or higher, but I really don't think it's necessary considering that most people are only going to touch this 2 times a year when they're swapping out their summer and their winter tires. From a functional standpoint, all you have to do is not puncture the tires that you're storing on the rack. The reality is, even if you didn't sand it at all, you probably would never puncture the tires. But like I said earlier, I am going to be having this installed about head level for me, so for that reason I want to dull the edges just so I'm not stabbing myself in the eye. Now I'm going to jump forward and show how the entire assembly is lined up, that way we know the end product we're shooting for.
This is the basic setup of how it's going to look. I've got the dowel rods here, the tire is going to sit right here, and this back plywood strip is going to be somewhere around here as a crossbar between these two verticals, and it's going to prevent the tire from hitting the wall. These two pieces with the 45-degree end cuts are going to go right here and support around where the middle of the tire's weight is going to be. I have the longer one on the vertical piece, and then I have the shorter one on the bottom. Depending on the size of the tires you're running and the width, you're going to have to adjust the width of the rack and or the depth of it to try to get the correct dimensions for your tire. The easiest way, rather than trying to do all the math out on paper, is just physically put the tire in, see how far it sags down between these two dowels, and then adjust the back height or the depth accordingly. Basically what you're going to do is go through all of your wood. You're going to figure out which side is the most presentable, and that's going to be the side that faces forward that you're going to see the most. So for example, on this back plywood strip, this side is a lot better looking than this one, which has a bunch of color variation and a kind of weird grain. So you can see I already wrote back across it just to remind myself that that's the side I want facing away and against the wall. Once you've oriented everything the way you want, you have to go through and figure out where your screw holes will be to connect everything the way you want them to connect. I would say for something like this where it's going to be supporting a good amount of weight, you have to use screws. I would not use nails in this application. Over time, the nails will probably start to separate. So for example, this piece over here, the 45 end cut, it's going to have a bit of a hole drilled on these two ends so I can put a screw straight through into the back and the bottom. Obviously you're going to want the screws reasonably centered against the wood, so what I did on the bottom is I marked 2 places where I'm going to drill the holes for the screws along the center line. Your 2 options are you can drill through the back out to the front, and then your holes might not be perfectly straight and the gap will look a little bit weird on the front, but at least you'll know from a structural standpoint that you are centered, so it should be more secure. Option 2 is you can drill from the front down and then try to make sure that they're centered to where you want them to be. And what that'll do is give you the opposite scenario where on the front they might look more centered and presentable, but on the bottom you're not really going to be guaranteed to have them exactly on the center line. The other locations you'll need to drill are in through the sides to go into the center of these crossbars, or the dowel pins in my case. For the back, what I'm going to be using is a pocket hole jig, I've already marked the locations here, and it's going to have a pocket hole that goes down and screws into the side of these vertical bars. Then when you get to these back corners on both sides, you could do pocket holes either on either of these to go into the sidebar. You could drill through the sidebar to go in. It really comes down to how you feel like doing it. Another option you could do, depending on how you want it to visually look at the end, is you could do an L bracket out of metal and then just bolt it to the top and the bottom pieces. Now I'll go through, I'll orient everything how I want it to be on the final product, and then I'll mark the locations that I need to drill for the screws later on.
The first thing I'm doing is orienting all the boards so that I can see the most visually appealing side in the normal circumstances. So because I'm having this at eye level, it's going to be relatively high up. So the better looking sides are going to be both forward facing and downward facing, because that's the angle I'm normally going to view this. I'm using drywall screws for the 45-degree end cut bits that are going to be on the side supports, and for pretty much everything else I'm using cabinet screws that I already had on hand. The one exception is for the plywood strip that I'm using on the backboard. I've got some Craig pocket hole screws that came with my pocket hole jig. For these vertical supports, I'm going straight through to connect to both of the horizontal pieces that are on each side. Make sure you stagger the holes if you're doing this so that the screws don't collide with each other, and that way it's also less likely to split the wood. For these vertical holes, I'm using the same tactic of drilling from the center on the inside through to the outside, and I know it runs the risk of not having a perfectly centered screw that you can see on the outside, but for me the structural integrity was more important. You can see here I'm using painter's tape to mark the depth because I need a thicker hole for the head of the screw compared to the rest of the shaft.
At this point, all the holes have been drilled for the screws that are going to go in for the final assembly, and the edges have been cleaned up with 80 grit sandpaper. It's also a good idea to clean the general area so your significant other doesn't know you made the home an absolute disaster while they were away at work. What we're going to do now is stain the wood to give it its final finish. What you could also do is paint it at this point, or if you want to use a polyurethane instead, you could use a poly. I'm going to show how to stain wood in a separate video. I'm going to put the link in the description below. Because that will all be contained in a separate video, this video is just going to jump ahead until after the stain is finished.
Now that everything is stained and cured, it is time for the final assembly.
Once your finish is applied, the first thing you need to do is orient everything how you want it for final assembly. If you marked it with a pencil like I did, it could be very difficult to tell, especially if you have a dark stain or a paint that's going over it. To try to remedy this problem, either mark on the cardboard that you lay up all the wood on, or put a piece of painter's tape over the wood and then write on the piece of painter's tape which way it's supposed to be oriented. You'll find that you're second guessing yourself a lot if you don't do this, and it's going to waste a lot of your time. Once you do have everything oriented how you want it for final assembly, you're ready to start putting it together. Put a dab of wood glue on each place that two different pieces come in contact, then put your screw in. I'm using a paper towel to clean up all the squeeze out at the joints after the screw was screwed in. For me, this is something that's going to be high in a wall in a garage and I'm not going to see it a lot, so I'm not using a square to make sure all my angles are perfect, but you're more than welcome to if that's how you'd like to proceed. I also don't have clamps on hand that are long enough to hold this together as I'm screwing everything in, but if you do, you'll find that the product at the end typically holds up much longer over time. Here you can see I'm trying to get the back panel into place, and I'm having a little bit of difficulty doing it because I don't have any clamps or holders. If you don't have clamps on hand, you almost will certainly need an extra set of hands here to hold it in place. If you're like me and you don't have any friends, it's very helpful to have a mail order bride on hand, and she can hold the wood in place while you screw it into position.
So this is the final assembled product. The two dimensions you're really going to need to change are the distance between these two supporting legs and the distance up from the bottom for this back wall. That's just going to keep the tires or wheels from bumping up against the walls. With how the tire is going to sit, this might be a little bit high, but for now the only thing this is going to be storing is a spare set of rims, and there's no tires on them, so they're only going to fit in here and they won't need that wall anyhow. That's all there really is to it. I'm going to use more of these cabinet screws to secure this to the wall in the garage now. I'm going to put a few in this back plate, but I'm going to do the majority of them up here on the side and then maybe down low on the legs. There you have it. Thanks for watching.